Hey everyone, today we're diving into the Hussite Wars, which took place from 1419 to around 1134 in Bohemia, what's now the Czech Republic. These wars were fought between the followers of Jan Hus, a reformer, and the Catholic loyalists. Even though the Catholics technically won, the Hussites succeeded in gaining religious freedom. So, why did these wars happen? It all started with the execution of Jan Hus in 1415, followed by the execution of his friend Jerome of Prague in 1416. Both were condemned as heretics by the Catholic Church. The Bohemian Reformation had been trying to address the Church's corruption since around 1380, but things got really heated after 1416. In 1419, a Hussite named Jan Zalewski led a procession through Prague that ended in the first defenestration of Prague, where 7 town council members were killed. This marked the beginning of the social unrest. Hus and Jerome were seen as martyrs, later even saints, and their followers were devoted to their cause. But the Hussites weren't a unified group. They were united mainly by their opposition to the Catholic Church and the forces of Sigismund of Hungary, the Holy Roman Emperor, who led the crusade against them. Jan Hus, the Hussite general, was a tactical genius. He never lost a battle against Sigismund. He used firearms and wagon forts in innovative ways, surprising his enemies with his mobile defenses. His tactics are still studied today. After Hus died of the plague in 1424, Prokop the Bold took over. He was also a great military leader, but faced the same issue of unifying the Hussite factions. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, the moderate Hussites teamed up with the Catholics to defeat the more radical Hussites. This battle ended the Hussite Wars. The moderates, known as Utraquists, were granted religious freedom at the Council of Basel in 1436, wrapping up the Hussite Wars and the Bohemian Reformation. But, as we know, religious conflicts didn't end there. Even though the Hussite Wars kicked off with the execution of Jan Hus, the Bohemian Reformation had actually been brewing for decades. Calls for reform and dissatisfaction with the Roman Catholic Church were nothing new. Priests and theologians in Bohemia had been pushing for change since before 1380. The church had split into the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in 1054, known as the Great Schism. This division hinted at deeper issues within the church's vision and policies. The Bohemian Church was initially influenced by Eastern Orthodox missionaries, but then had to adapt to Roman Catholic policies. Because of this, Bohemian clergy were slow to accept and implement these policies, having been used to developing their own. The authority of the Roman Church was further questioned during the Western Schism, when there were 2 and then 3 popes all claiming to be the true pope and all demanding money from the people. As scholar Francis Lutzow noted, Bohemia initially suffered less from the Roman pope's extortions due to its location. However, as the number of countries supporting the rival popes dwindled, Rome's demands on Bohemia grew more frequent and urgent. This dissatisfaction found a stronghold at the University of Prague. Jan Hus became the rector of the University of Prague in 1402. That same year, his friend Jerome of Prague introduced him to the works of the English reformer John Wycliffe. Wycliffe had criticized the church's practices in England, particularly condemning the sale of indulgences and questioning the Pope's authority. He also criticized the church's land ownership, seeing these as corruptions of Christ's teachings. Hus was deeply influenced by Wycliffe's writings and began to preach his own reform ideas at the Bethlehem Chapel, where services were held in Czech instead of Latin. This allowed him to speak directly to his congregation, who understood Czech but not Latin. His passionate sermons and the spread of his ideas through woodblock printed pamphlets fueled the reform movement in the region. In 1414, Hus was called to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe passage to explain his views. However, he was betrayed, imprisoned, and executed in July 1415. Jerome of Prague, who defended Hus, was burned at the stake a year later. This led Hus supporters, the Hussites, to openly protest against the church's policies, sparking the Hussite Wars. After the execution of Jan Hus, Hussite preachers condemned the act, but the first major protest was led by the priest Jan Zalewski. He organized a procession through Prague to oppose the town council's decision not to release Hussite prisoners. During the protest, stones were thrown from the town hall windows, and one struck Zalewski. In response, he and his followers stormed the building and threw 7 town council members out of the upper story windows to their deaths. This event is known as the First Defenestration of Prague. On July 30, 1419, Jan Zalewski led this dramatic demonstration, which resulted in the Hussites taking over the city. He had strongly criticized the authorities for the executions of Hus and other martyrs, equating these acts to murder. The killing of the town council members shocked the authorities and reportedly caused King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia to die of a stroke upon hearing the news. His half-brother, Sigismund of Hungary, sought permission from the Pope to launch a crusade against the Hussites, and thus the Hussite Wars began. Hussites were arrested and burned at the stake. In 1422, Zalewski himself was captured, handed over to the town council of Prague, and executed. And Wenceslaus IV's widow, Sophia, who had admired Hus, raised a mercenary army and attacked the Hussites in Prague, destroying half the city. In March 1420, Pope Martin V granted Sigismund permission to launch his crusade, joined by German nobles eager for plunder. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Hussites, under the leadership of Jan Hus, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Sudomer on March 25, 1420. This battle showcased Hus's innovative use of war wagons and strategic brilliance in choosing the battlefield. The crusade continued, with Sigismund laying siege to Prague. Before further hostilities, the Hussites presented their demands in the 4 Articles of Prague. They demanded the right to preach freely, celebrate the Eucharist with both bread and wine for the laity, prohibit clergy from owning large estates or holding secular power, and to punish mortal sins regardless of social status. The second article, concerning the Eucharist, was a major rallying point for the Hussites. The Catholic Church only allowed the laity to receive bread during communion, reserving the wine for priests. This practice symbolized the Church's control and was seen by the Hussites as a barrier between the people and God. The concept of freedom of the chalice, or utriquism, which meant receiving both bread and wine, became a unifying cause for the Hussites, symbolized by the chalice on their standards and shields. However, there were many factions within the Hussites, such as the moderate Utriquists and the radical Taborites, each with different interpretations of Hus teachings. Sigismund rejected the Articles of Prague as they challenged the Church's authority and continued his siege. Hus then took a small force to Vied Hill, a strategic position overlooking the valley. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Hus's defensive tactics led to a significant Hussite victory, driving back Sigismund's forces and inflicting heavy losses. This victory bolstered the Hussite cause, attracting more supporters to defend their land. After their victories at Sudomer and Vied Hill, the Hussite army, led by Jan Hus, realized they could use their everyday farming tools and carts effectively in battle. The Hussites, mostly peasants, were already skilled with tools like pitchforks, flails, and bows, and they knew how to handle wagons. This led Hus to create the Wagenburg, or wagon fort. These were reinforced farm wagons used in combat, born out of necessity since the Hussites were initially poorly equipped and lacked military training. Each wagon fort was manned by 20 soldiers, including both men and women. These soldiers were divided into groups of crossbowmen, gunmen, pikemen, and those wielding flails. The sides of the wagons facing the enemy were heavily reinforced with wood and metal, turning them into mobile fortresses. In battle, the wagons would form a square with artillery positioned behind and between them. The artillery would start with a barrage, causing heavy casualties. When the enemy cavalry charged, handguns and crossbows would take out the horses, and the pikemen and others would attack the dismounted knights. Hus used these wagon forts effectively during the Battle of Kutná Hora in December 1421, the climax of Sigismund's Second Crusade. Hus positioned the wagons between Sigismund's forces and the town, but as Sigismund received reinforcements, the Hussites found themselves surrounded. On December 21st, instead of surrendering, Hus organized the wagons into a column and charged through Sigismund's army. The wagons kept up a continuous barrage with firearms, crossbows, and an early form of the howitzer, breaking the enemy lines. Hus led his mobile fortresses away while Sigismund dealt with his dead and wounded, choosing not to pursue. While Hus could unite the various Hussite factions like the Utriquists and Taborites in battle, they would quickly turn on each other over doctrinal differences after each victory. To maintain order, Hus reached out to King Władysław II of Poland, offering him rule over Bohemia, but he refused. Hus then approached his cousin Vytautas, who agreed only if the Hussites surrendered and recognized the authority of the church, which Hus refused. Eventually, Lithuanian Prince Sigismund Karybut accepted the role without conditions and was recognized by the Hussites. However, He was soon pressured to return to Lithuania by Sigismund of Hungary, causing the Hussites to start fighting among themselves again. Siska led the Taborites to victory against the Utraquists in April 1423, resulting in a brief truce. However, this peace didn't last, and their attempt to invade Moravia later that year failed due to their lack of unity. Siska died in October 1424 from the plague, still undefeated in battle. He was succeeded by Prokop the Bold, who, alongside Sigismund Karibet, continued to lead the Hussites to victories through 426. And despite the Pope's call for a third crusade against the Hussites, neighboring kingdoms showed little interest. Prokop the Bold, continuing the policy of glorious rides initiated by his predecessor Tsiska, launched raids against kingdoms that had supported earlier crusades, sacking areas of Hungary, Meissen, Saxony, and others. While the Hussites fought well together as a unified force against a common enemy, they struggled to maintain this unity after victories. Tensions finally boiled over into the Battle of Lipany on May 30, 1434, where the Utraquists joined forces with Catholic loyalists against the Taborites. Commanded by Prokop the Bold and Jan Chopek of Sani, the Taborites utilized their wagon fort strategically. However, facing an enemy who knew their tactics, the tide turned. Prokop's initial offensive seemed successful, but it was a trap. The Utraquist forces counterattacked while their cavalry, previously hidden, entered the fray. Prokop was killed in battle, and his forces were decimated, with survivors later burned as heretics. And the Battle of Lipany marked the effective end of the Hussite Wars, with an official peace accord reached 2 years later at the Council of Basel. Influenced by pacifist thinker Petr Chelsicky, the Hussite platform shifted towards peaceful reforms. Chelsicky's views formed the foundation of the unity of the Brethren, advocating further reforms peacefully. After years of devastation and millions killed between 1420 and 1436, a modified version of the Four Articles of Prague was accepted by the Catholic Church at the Council of Basel. The Utraquists were granted the religious freedom they had fought for, as they were seen as redeemed through their abandonment of the Taborites at Lipany. However, the Utraquists themselves would later emulate the hierarchy of the Church and sought its approval for the ordination of clergy. Over time, they became the religious authority in Bohemia, persecuting those who opposed them, much like the Roman Catholic Church had once persecuted them.